Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, rather. Welcome to the session today, which is Opportunity Beckons. Can I have the next slide, please, Daniel? Brilliant, super. So a quick note on pacing. You've probably heard of ZFS, which is as I've been told, Zoom fatigue syndrome. So what we're going to try and do is keep this session particularly pacey. So we're making a bit of an assumption here that everyone sat in on this webinar is highly motivated and a highly functioning individual. So this is halfway between kind of a recap of some of the things that you might be aware of and also a bit of a masterclass. So we'll be going down the rabbit hole on a few specific ways of thinking or examples or potentially tools that you could apply in a practical way to your own practice on a daily basis as a result of the pandemic. As Francesca's already said, this is relatively quick. So this is a 50-minute session with an extended Q&A afterwards. Rather than pausing the flow of the presentation, we've asked you to please use the Q&A function. If you have any comments, questions or observations, just put them in there and Daniel and Francesca will kind of concierge that for me. So towards the end, we'll be able to field those questions. A further thing, you have a copy of these notes, and if anything else is of interest that I maybe mention, please feel free to contact the RAE team directly, and they'll be able to forward any specific inquiries to me, and we can return any specific resources that you might find useful. Next slide, please, Daniel. Thank you. So in this session, we're going to look at basically three main things. The first is some examples. We're aware that market conditions change. So when market conditions change, we can either be very scared and kind of retreat into a safe position, or we can look around and see where the opportunity lies for us. So we're going to look at some examples that may seem apocalyptic, but actually are quite interesting in how the organizations have adapted to those opportunities. Then we'll look at, begin to look at scenario planning and some tools and approaches that might be appropriate for you to use. Then we'll look at the market considerations and changes. So that's really on a practical level, risk, issues and continuity, continuity of service. And then finally, we'll have an extended Q&A and we'll be able to field your questions specifically. Next slide, please. Thank you. So jumping in, there's some very specific COVID examples here, and these are all kind of dear and close to us at Red Ochre, and I'll kind of just quickly scoot through a couple of them for you, just to illustrate some of the issues that the organisations that we've been dealing with have experienced, but also how they've decided to either pivot or react, or either by doing something different, looking at the opportunity because of the changing market, or looking for a different customer type. So we'll start with a trade finance. This is a slightly peripheral because this is around finance rather than a product-based organization. But historically, what they've done is they've provided funding, working capital for SMEs. Now, in the past, that's been relatively stable. It's been a relatively high volume but low margin model. That was fine as far as things went. There was a massive change though with COVID, because even large businesses have been denied funding by commercial banks, specifically for capital funding for export. So what they've done is trade finance have pivoted away from SME market, which they've traditionally been focused on with a low margin, to bigger businesses, primarily because they're now experiencing a market failure. So it's, don't only think about the market failure you're experiencing as an enterprise, think about your customers and what problems they're experiencing. Can you massage or reposition your offer to make sure that they that their issue is solved by your new offer? Looking at Bathroom by Design, they're an organization that provides bathroom accessories of all types, from taps through to bars themselves and everything in between. Normally, they do lots of their sales through the high street. So they have a small range of retail outlets, as well as providing sales direct to developers and home builders themselves. So they've got a mixed model of a business to business and business to consumer with retail thrown in, as well as direct online. Because people are staying at home for longer, because of lockdown, working from home and furlough, the vast majority of citizens now have a house that is their home, their social space, and their working office, effectively. So because they're spending more time at home, they're beginning to see things that they're dissatisfied with. So therefore, they're spending more money. This is kind of a bit of a trend that's highlighted and reflected with DIY organizations generally. So this is not builders merchants. So builders merchants are having a bit of a hard time because for a couple of months there wasn't a lot of substantive building work. But for DIY outlets specifically, and people involved in providing services and products for people inside their house, interior design, quite an opportunity here. So another key learning bit from here is think about the changing position of your and needs of your customer, but extending that a little bit. It's not all market conditions and all customer types are the same, even though they look the same, and your offer may look very similar to some of your competition. You are different from your competition. You'll be able to offer something different. So just because some of your competition is pivoting in a certain way or experiencing a downturn doesn't necessarily mean you will, if you have a better understanding of the need of your customers. Moving on to the third example here, we've got Yes Please Productions. They effectively do all of those kind of cool video animations and kind of text effects you get on videos that you see on things like Vimeo and YouTube. Most of their clients are actually within the commercial world, within the music industry. So as people are staying at home, streaming more music, looking at more music videos, there's much more of an appetite for their service. So actually this kind of remote way of working, provision of remote entertainment, stay-at-home entertainment is quite an opportunity for a lot of people. So this is reflected more specifically, more widely by organizations like Netflix and Spotify. They're kind of reflecting this general trend. And then lastly, there's the Whole Story, which is an organization that delivers leadership development. This specifically coaching, sort of one-to-one, working on specific technical skills for people in the commercial context. Traditionally, that's been done face-to-face. Actually, as long as you've got something like a video, maybe Google Hangouts, maybe Zoom, you don't actually need physical interaction, as long as there's kind of one-to-one interaction. So we've seen this, the kind of rise of pseudo face-to-face, video one-to-one sessions. This, for instance, Zoom are making a lot of money out of this. There's all sorts of opportunity, as long as you understand what's the value that your customers get. Is it you physically being in a place, or is it the value of the insight or the knowledge that you bring to them? Next slide, please, Daniel. Thank you. So moving on, let's think a little bit about anticipating the opportunities, because we know that change is going to happen. So there might be change from coming from all sorts of different drivers within the marketplace, whether they're macro, whether they're micro, whether they're demographic, whether they're environmental. So there's a variety of ways we can think about what they might be, and then think about how we might react to those. So one of the things we can do is just take a best guess. Unfortunately, because of the way humans tend to work, our guesses for the future tend to be based on our recent experience, and we tend to over predict something that's happened recently. So everyone is probably going to be very, very worried about COVID-20, COVID-21, COVID-22, whatever the next global pandemic might be. But the chances of a global pandemic happening very, very quickly, aside from a second peak, is relatively low. It's far more likely to be something to do with, I'm not sure, maybe the decarbonisation of the energy sector, the economy generally. It might be disruption to global logistics and transport as a result of another eruption somewhere or something along those lines. So there's going to be all sorts of different changes and pressures that affect us as commercial organizations. If we guess, we are probably going to guess on the wrong thing. So if possible, it might be a useful thing to do to try, and I'm trying to say try in italics, to try and predict the future. If we could predict the future with any degree of certainty, we'd all be millionaires, no doubt. But at least going through the exercise will help us have a greater awareness of what the potential drivers might be. Once we know what the potential drivers might be, at least thematically, we are then better positioned to address what those futures might be. So the next question is, if we think there are going to be 50 different things that could affect us, what do we do about those? Do we try and have a plan for all of them? Do we have a plan for some of them, the most likely ones, the scariest ones, the ones that have the most impact? As an example, most of us have probably seen kind of scary movies about an asteroid hitting us. That's highly unlikely that it will happen, but if it does happen, it's game over for the vast majority of us. We can't really do a great deal about that. Even though the impact will be catastrophic, we can't do a great deal, so it's probably not worth planning for that particular eventuality. Okay, so this is a conceptual filter that we can begin to apply to some of these scenarios that are available to us. In a moment, we'll start looking at specific tools and specific filters that we can use. Next slide, please, Daniel. Fantastic, thank you. So here, I'll have a very brief slide on looking at what some of those opportunities might be. So what those changes might be, and as a result of the changes in the marketplace, what the opportunity for us might be. So there are two main ways of doing this. One is active and the other is passive. So you've probably heard of the phrase environmental scanning. This effectively means just looking outside of our own organization. It doesn't necessarily mean looking at the natural environment. It means looking at the natural environment, society, the economy generally. So there's all sorts of ways we can get information. So some of this might be led by our own activity. So we might do our own research, but we might also buy commercially available research. No doubt the RAE has got lots of access to lots of market research as well. So that will be a really good starting point to get some kind of market trends analysis. You're probably also aware of things like social listening. Social listening is effectively no more than listening to the chatter on different social media channels. So if you're on Twitter, what's the trend at the moment? If you're on LinkedIn, okay, what the hashtags that are most searched on at the moment? It gives us an idea of what's of interest to other people. Other people are potentially our market and our competitors. So getting an understanding of where the center of gravity of the marketplace is shifting towards really helps strengthen our understanding what the potential next step might be. The next is, rather than looking just at social media, looking at the media more generally. So this is things like radio, TV, print, specialist press, those kinds of things. There's a variety of services that you can subscribe to, or just spend your own time, put some searches in, see what's happening out there. I've also got a little diagram in the bottom right hand corner of this slide, just to illustrate something that I quite like at the moment, which is search listening. So search listening is trying to understand what questions are being asked by users of search engines, things like Google, Bing, that kind of thing. And there's a variety of different tools to allow me to do this, but the most useful one that I've come across is Answer the Public. So Answer the Public, go to the website. If possible, have a variety of seed terms that you want to explore. So as an example here, I just said, what is the secret of life? So from here, you get a bit of an understanding based by the type of question thematically that people are asking around the secret of life. So where can you get the secret of life? When? Who has the answer? How do I get access to this kind of esoteric information, that kind of thing? So a jumping on point here is not just to have one seed term, but have multiple seed terms. And the idea here is not so much that you will get lots of answers, but you will understand better what the questions being asked by your customers are. And your customers are a really good bellwether for what is happening commercially. Which brings us lastly, on the active environmental scanning theme, to using your users. Your customers are not only a resource in as much as they exchange value with you, you provide some kind of value proposition to them, and they provide you with money in return, but also they have insight. They have a series of needs, some of which you address. You will never address all of your users' needs, but you'll understand if you have a conversation with them over time what their needs are, and are they changing? If they're changing, they will be in a position to guide you. So use them if you can. And then lastly, there are a couple of interesting ways to get feedback from the marketplace in a passive way. So the first is just listening to what your customers are telling you. Instead of going out and actively canvassing them, listen to your feedback, okay, and pay attention. So communication is absolutely two-way. It's not about you talking to them, it's about you listening as well. And going beyond listening is also trying to gain insight from what they're saying and incorporating that learning within your offer. And then finally, there may be things that you just feel, or you just know to be true, and you can't quite put your finger on why. This is an interesting thing called, I think it's been coined, expert intuition. And there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which explores this, amongst other things. But a great example is, you could get, if you need your house painted, you'll get a professional decorator in. They'll look around, they won't be writing anything down, and they'll give you an estimate. When they give you a quote, it will normally be accurate to within about 10% plus or minus, because they just know in their head what they're doing. They sometimes struggle articulating what it is they've done and how they've done it, but actually the intellectual process, the way they've captured information, extracted value, and come up with a conclusion is kind of built into their DNA. And no doubt you, as entrepreneurs and innovators, you have this kind of behavior, these kind of skills built into you already. So if you feel something, I wouldn't say bet the whole farm on it. I wouldn't say go 100% down on it, expert intuition, but it is a really good guide. So it will steer you in the direction you need to go in, and then fill in the gaps later. Next slide, please, Daniel. Thank you. So we're going to look a little bit more specifically at 2 or 3 tools about reacting to what we think are going to be specific changes to the marketplace, and then planning for what those changes might be. So the first one we're going to look at is the business model canvas. Now, hopefully, the vast majority of you are familiar, at least conceptually, with the model canvas. For those of you that aren't, it's merely a graphical tool that helps you break down how you use limited resources and people to do things that delivers value to people. Everything on the right hand side, everything yellow, coded yellow on this, is market facing, which should give you some money. That's things like branding, marketing, PR. Everything below that is how you extract money from the relationship you have with your customers. The middle is kind of the beating heart, the value proposition, the value that you deliver to people. And everything on the left is a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, all of the hidden magic behind the curtain. So it's literally your proprietary processes, your key activities, your key resources, the partnerships you have with partners with which you couldn't be able to deliver value to your customers. Everything on that side of the model canvas has a cost implication. Looking at the bottom of that canvas, everything on the left, hopefully, is your costs. That will be less, with luck, than everything on the right. So that means you will earn more money than you'll spend over time. Okay, so that's basically a way to look at your model at any one moment in time. So if you've been lucky enough to look at some of either the slides in the previous sessions or actually been on the webinars towards the beginning of this program of sessions, you would have heard either Uday or myself talking about strategy or how to come up with nimble strategies. So I'm just going to recap that very, very quickly, and also refer you to some additional resource that you might find useful. So the strategy at its simplest is figuring out where you are, so assessing what the current state is, assessing where you want to be, so aspiring to a future state, and then deciding what to change and what to do in between now and the future, which is architecting. So if you're interested in the assess, aspire, and architect model, look up McKinsey. They've got a model imaginatively called the 5 A's, and the first 3 of which are aspire, assess, and architect. And they will really help you begin to think about how to plan your strategy in a replicable way. Because what we're trying to do is not be a one-trick pony, not come up with one good idea or notice one thing about the market opportunity, but be able to have a process that can repeat again and again with a high degree of confidence that the outcome will be of high quality and fit for purpose. Okay, so that's strategy. So normally in a strategy, we say we have one vision of future and we know where we are now, and so therefore we have one strategy for growth. When we're thinking about a market in constant flux, or where there might be lots of market opportunity, one of the ways to think about planning for the future is to have multiple scenarios. So what does the marketplace look like in the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, the most likely scenario, catastrophic scenario? So come up with a variety of different scenarios, and then that gives you an idea of what the market conditions are going to be. Conversations we've had over the last month or so, you'll hopefully recall that the model canvas is a way of you using your limited resources to deliver value to the marketplace. So if the marketplace is different, your model will be different. So the next step after thinking about what the different market conditions is what is the different model canvas or business model that you have likely to be? How are you going to optimize it for a different market situation? As an example, if you are a street food company, your traditional strategy would be to have a street stall, for instance. But what you might do is you might say, because of COVID, there are 2 or 3 options. What we might do is we might ship ingredients to people. How can we make money out of shipping ingredients to people? Do they want to cook their own food? Oh, maybe we extend that. So we have a second business model canvas where we ship food, and we also provide them with maybe video that shows them how to use the ingredients to make their own food. Okay. Or you might say what we're going to do is we have a fleet of trucks. Instead of using the trucks to deliver or provide a space where we can provide street food for our customers, what we're going to do is we are going to take a step back completely from street food and think about the value of what the vehicle does, and we repurpose our fleet for delivery. So we effectively subcontract to GDP or Amazon Delivery or something along those lines. So there's lots of different things you could do in relation to potentially different changes to the marketplace over time. Okay, so that's the first way of doing things. The next way of thinking about scenarios is I'm going to make a big assumption that many of you have played Top Trumps in the past. So for those of you who don't know, Top Trumps is a game where you compare seemingly different things. So you might compare a white van and a Ferrari, or Prince Charles and Elton John, or the Hulk and Thor, whatever it is. So you compare seemingly dissimilar things. How do you compare dissimilar things and make a decision as to which is better? The way you do that is by extracting or settling on specific themes that you judge as important to be able to help you make the decision. So we're now getting into the balanced scorecard way of looking at things, because historically the vast majority of organizations have been seen as successful measured on one set of criteria, which are financial criteria only. But there might be other criteria. So it might be how aligned is it to our vision? Does it give us market penetration? Or even something as simple as, does it help us survive the next 3 months? Okay, so you might have a variety of different criteria that you can help compare different scenarios. By using a top trumps approach, you don't even need to go into the level of detail that you need to do maybe 3 or 4 business model canvases and compare the canvases. What you might do is just have a very brief business case of 2 or 3 paragraphs. You might look at risk, investment and return, and the times of the rate of return, your vision, and maybe whether you intuit that this is a good thing to do, whether you want to do it or not. That last comment may sound a bit flippant, but if you are doing this because the figures say so and you don't want to do it, it will just feel like work and you won't be particularly motivated. And because you're not motivated, not fully committed to this course of action, it's less likely that you'll be successful. So being aware that your mental vision and how mentally engaged you are with a particular course of action will really help you make a decision as to whether you are going to be successful or not. So in some ways, this is a leading indicator, and unfortunately, it's not quantitative. It's completely qualitative, and it's down to you. You're the only person that will know this. The other thing to be aware of is when you are looking, or when you're using things like the model canvas to look at different scenarios, you do have the opportunity of doing zero-sum forecasts. So when you're modeling your business, the different parts of your business, we start with 0 cost and 0 revenues. You can use as you incur costs, you deploy resources, have additional people doing things, develop partnerships. All of those have a cost implication. So you start with 0 and you add to that. The flip side, on the other part of the forecast, the market-facing side of the forecast is, how do you engage in marketing? How do you acquire your customers? How much does that cost? How much do you earn from them? Is it an ongoing revenue base? Is it a long tail? Is it product or service where it's paid up front? And all of those come out in the wash. And you start with 0 and then you add to it. Now, the thing about zero-sum forecasting is, one, it is slightly more robust and accurate than traditional ways of forecasting because it's built on a model. So that's the upside. The downside is it's a little bit more hard work. So if you're trying to do things quickly, you might choose not to do zero-sum forecasts, but if you've got a little bit of time to think about alternative changes to the marketplace and alternative responses from you to those changes to the marketplace, it might be worthwhile investing now when you have the opportunity to do so. Thank you, Daniel. Can you have the next slide, please? So a little bit more explicitly, I'm going to give you a couple of specific ways you can use scenario planning to help you adapt to the world. So the 2 main ways that I'm going to discuss are constrained and unconstrained innovation. So constrained innovation, and I'm going to do this very simplistically and from the framework of using a business model canvas. Imagine you have only a quarter or maybe a tenth of the resources you have available to you normally. What does that mean to your business model? How do you deliver value to your customers? A simple scalar or linear way of doing this is you say, well, if I've got 10% of the resources, I just deliver 10% of the value, or I only reach 10% of the customers, or I only make 10% of the money. Another way of thinking about this is, how can you radically change what you're doing to still deliver value? So for instance, instead of trading face to face, you could trade online. So instead of having 10 people in a room, you might have 160 people in a room. I mean, you probably wouldn't want 160 people on a Zoom call at the best of times, but at least technically those options are there for you to do. So that's one way to help you think about how you can change your offer. Okay, so related to constrained innovation is provocative operation. So if you're interested, there's lots of literature on provocative operations, or POS. I think it was De Bono that started those. So that they're closely related to constrained innovation. Really useful for thinking about market changes where your market has no money or has less resources, or where you suddenly have less resources. Also a great way to think about moving into a new market where you don't want to risk investing too much money too soon without evidence of market appetite. The other way of thinking about scenario planning for the future is unconstrained innovation, and you can probably take a guess at what this might mean. If constrained innovation is thinking about maybe having a quarter or only a tenth rather of the resources we normally have, unconstrained innovation is about saying, what would our business model look like and the value that we deliver to our customers look like if we had maybe 100 times or 10 times the current resources we have. So this is a good way of thinking about modeling for scale. So if you're thinking about growing your organization, what does a hockey stick look like? Or if you're looking for corporate venturing or venture capital, or a large scale investment from a bank of some description, once you have a lot of resource, how would you deploy it? This gives you an idea of how you are using the new resource you have to grow your organization and repay the capital growth. So this is a really interesting tool for you to help you get investment for your organization as it grows. Cool. Thank you, Daniel. Can we move on a little bit? Super. So I'm going to delve down this rabbit hole in a little bit more detail. I'm going to introduce you to a tool called the Windows of Change. So this is a slightly massaged version. So this is not the standard version that's used by McKinsey. This is a slightly different version that we use at Red Ochre. And I've taken the liberty, instead of doing it on the traditional 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year timescale, because we are living in a world of constant change, I've broken this down into tiny little sprints and scrums of 6 months at a time. So this strategic development plan looks at what might happen in maybe three half-year sprints over the next year and a half. If you wanted to, you could do 4 sprints over a year, so you could do quarterly sprints as well. And this looks at different parts of your organization. It's really explicit, and the reason I like this is it focuses our attention and our limited resources on 1 or 2 things. So work in progress has no value. So if we're thinking about getting more customers, we don't necessarily want to invest lots of money in redoing our website, redoing our branding, doing lots of focus groups, and doing some direct sales. If you're only interested in getting new customers, at least for the first instance, focus on direct sales. So this is a way to help us understand what's important and prioritize and focus our limited attention on that. So looking at this is basically a logic diagram. If you can read the Beano, you can read this. You start in the top left-hand corner and you go across and down. So the first thing is we're looking at the current state externally. So this is what the market conditions are like externally. So this is what the market need is, the market failure, the competition, where the center of gravity of the market is moving to. And so this is what the external world looks like. So thinking about what we've been talking about so far, this is the external environment. Below that, we have how we respond to this. So this is the skills, the capabilities we have, the people, the knowledge, the IP, the machines, the algorithms, the products we have, and how those might change over time. The interesting bit here, and this is a bit like the glue between what we have and how we do things and how we deliver value to our customers, is the value creation. How do we create value for our customers? So at its simplest, this might be something like a product or service, or a new product or service, or it might be a refinement to an existing value proposition that we currently have with our customers. So we'll find that as the external market changes, our how we deploy our internal resources changes, and therefore as a consequence the value and how we create value for our customers changes. So what you should do is you should see one or two things change every couple of months, or every 6 months in this case. Now mapping what the world looks like and mapping what our organization should look like, that's relatively straightforward. That's planning. The interesting bit, where it moves from just modeling something to strategy, understanding what we could change to make sure that we're in the best position to meet those market changes, is the gap analysis. So what do we need to change between now and 6 months? What do we need to change between 6 months and 12 months, and so on and so forth? So it's the gap analysis, extracting value and knowledge and insight from that, rather, and then saying we're going to look at maybe one thing internally and one way we're going to change our value creation. That's what's going to help you. So making marginal changes over time. So that the key point here is, it's not about understanding what the world is like in the future or what it's like now. The most important thing about being able to adapt to changing market conditions is having those, and then understanding how you need to change to make sure that you're in the best position to do so. If you're interested, drop me a line or contact the RAE Hub directly, and we can provide you with templates of these tools as well. And it might be worthwhile at least quickly scooting through them and then picking out maybe one or two changes that you might be able to make to your organization over time as a result of your increased understanding of what the changes might be. Thank you very much, Daniel. Can we have the next slide, please? Super. So what we're going to do now for the last 15 minutes or so is look at risk. So changing market conditions, this really is about what might happen. That's risk. What actually happens is an issue. And then finally, if you have an issue, how do you make sure that your organization is still able to deliver the value you've promised, your brand promised to your customers? Okay, so the key takeaway here is you don't exist in a vacuum. You are part of a much wider ecosystem, and in the real world, unless you're someone like Kinetic or Apple, you're going to be a small player. So you're going to be forced to react to what other drivers within the marketplace are going to do, and they are competitors, the government, the environment, even tiny little viral particles. They can massively affect the world we operate in. Thank you, Daniel. Can we flip on? Next slide, please. Smashing, super. So just being very explicit. So I mentioned very briefly that risks are things that could have an impact on your organization, your project, your new product introduction. Now, these are things that might happen. Okay. The most important thing about thinking about scenario planning is some of those risks will actually happen. So actually, once they've become issues, using COVID as an example, a risk might be a global pandemic. The issue now is there is a global pandemic, and as a consequence of the global pandemic, we have lockdown. It's very difficult to get a haircut until last week. Difficult to get food. No one wants to travel on public transport, and so on and so forth. So those are issues that happen as a result of something actually happening. Okay, so there is absolutely a difference between risk and issues. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just a quick kind of, not even a top 10, some quick examples of the kinds of risks that you might face. And for some of us, they might not actually be risks. They might be already issues. So looking at kind of a macroeconomic set of drivers. So I've just put China here as an example. So for some people, this might be a kind of a philosophical issue about maybe democratic considerations. For some of us, it might be about national security. Others, it might be about access to technology as a consequence of national security issues. It might be sanctions or trade wars, or it might be, I'm going to be a little bit flippant here. You're a farmer in the UK. You've always thrown away pig trotters. Oh, in China, everyone eats pig trotters. We're going to ship pig trotters to China. That was a market opportunity that was spotted. And I think China is now the biggest export market for pig trotters in Europe, I believe. So there may well be lots of negative connotations to specific actors within the global marketplace, but there'll always be opportunity. Another interesting one here, I've put down on the third point, supply chain issues. So this is Boohoo. So there's a couple of issues here. I mean, the first is, the issue about Boohoo is where their clothes have been made, potentially has been seen as having exploitative human resource kind of practices. So Boohoo's supply chain has been pushing back a little bit, so some of their channels to market have delisted Boohoo, so they're no longer available on some online platforms, for instance. So there are issues about channels to market. There's issues about bad press and the brand and brand promise generally. There are also business and continuity issues. So there's a whole range of problems that have come out of potentially one issue or one risk rather becoming an issue. Okay, next slide, please. Super. So what I'm going to do just for a moment is going to think instead of externally, internally about our organization. So I'm going to make a bit of an assumption that, that although some of you may be leaders of virtual teams, the vast majority of you will have at least some people working for you. And this is a way of thinking about the kinds of people that work for you, the kinds of people to avoid, and even if you do have underperforming members of your team, how to develop them. The reason we're being explicit about this is the vast majority of risk within an organization comes from your people. Externally, it comes from things like macroeconomic changes and changes to the marketplace generally. But internally, it's mainly people. So I'm going to start with something simple. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have examples of people with low levels of competence and low levels of initiative. So they just go through the motions. They're effectively a dying house plant in the corner of your office. Ideally, don't try and hire someone like that. If you do have someone like that, one thing you can do is increase their competence, their technical ability to do something. So their maybe their skill sets, their knowledge about tool sets, those kinds of things. So it's relatively easy to increase someone's technical knowledge. It's actually relatively difficult to change the way they behave. And initiative, being able to be a self-starter and do things on your own, that is definitely a behavior. And behavioral change is incredibly hard to do in people, especially if you don't have access to them all of the time. Since we're talking about high levels of initiative, normally we're led to believe that high levels of initiative is a really desirable set of behaviors or behavior to seek out in our staff. That's great if you're competent, because you're a rainmaker, you're a self-starter, you can go out and you can get new business and service new business. That's all well and good. But what happens if you're a go-getter, but you literally don't have the skills or knowledge to back up? Well, that's an example. That's a salesman that says yes to everything and then sells a product that doesn't exist. Or using a historical example, charge of the Light Brigade. So not always is high levels of initiative a good thing. And then lastly, in the top left-hand corner, we have high levels of competence but low levels of initiative. So this might be bureaucrat or more likely a technocrat, someone that's really good at doing a specific thing. So they're really good at maybe I don't know, integrating micro components onto a tiny circuit board, maybe understanding market need, maybe quantitative analysis, whatever it is. But that's all they do. They don't have the initiative, either the will or the behavior, the intrinsic desire to be able to say, right, I'm going to do something else, something different. Now, historically, we've kind of many people have looked down their nose at technocrats, but the vast majority of organizations, without technocrats, they wouldn't exist. So you do need highly skilled people that are really good at one or two things. You just wind them up and let them go. So ideally, you'd have one or two rainmakers, and hopefully you, as the lead entrepreneur within your organization, you are a rainmaker, and you have a team of technocrats to help you deliver your brand promise to your customers. If you do have pot plants, people with low levels of competence and initiative, you develop their competence. Try and avoid people with high levels of competence, high levels of initiative and no competence, because they are likely to be very dangerous and they're going to do a lot of damage to your organization before you can increase their levels of competence. Thanks, Daniel. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so what I've done here quickly is flashed up two ways of thinking about different headings that you might use within your risk management strategy. So on the left, these are typical kind of headings you would see in a historical risk register, or maybe parts of your SWOT, or maybe your PESTLE analysis for your business plan. So that's one way of thinking about it. That's kind of a very process-driven, just so way of doing things. Another way of doing things, a slightly more practical or intuitive way of doing things, is recasting the kind of issues or risks or drivers you might have on your organization by looking at some questions or reframing it as a failure to do something, a loss of customers, loss of revenue, contraction of profit margin, non-compliance with GDPR, those kinds of things. So this is a way to help you almost have a conversation with yourself, or hopefully if you have a team, literally a conversation where the narrative comes out of the discussion, and from the narrative you can then extract your risk register. So personally, I really like the conversive way of coming up with a risk register, the one on the right. Next slide, please, Daniel. Super. So just very, very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flash up an example of risk, just to walk us through, because the vast majority of us, when we hear about risk and risk management, most risk specialists talk about 4 strategies for risk. There are actually 6. Because the 2, mitigate and transfer, there are 2 flavors of each of those. So from a helicopter level, there are 4, but on a practical note, and we're being practical, we are entrepreneurs, we are delivering products and services to customers. We need to know what we can do on a practical level. So just illustrating this as an example, we've got a house by the river. You've got a variety of ways of managing this risk. The first is you say, well, I don't want to get flooded at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to live on a hill. Okay, so in this case, you're avoiding the issue completely. Another way of thinking about this is, well, I quite like the water, the sound of water, so it doesn't matter if I get flooded. I'm just going to live here as is, and that's what I'm going to do. So they're the kind of the 2 atomic options, either doing everything you can to avoid an issue, a risk becoming an issue, or just accepting that it is going to happen. Okay. Most of it exist in the gap between those 2 atomic options, between those goalposts. And we spend most of our time trying to mitigate the event and the impact. So a way to mitigate the events, the chance of the flood happening, is maybe to have a levee, build a levee or some kind of barrier by the water, so you're not going to get flooded, or maybe build your house on stilts, or do both. So that reduces the chance that your house is going to be flooded, but your house might still get flooded anyway. Another way to reduce the impact of being flooded might be to say, I'm going to get rid of my carpet, I'm going to have lino, and I'm just going to be able to clean out the water very quickly and everything will dry out. So there are two ways to use mitigation. One is to mitigate risk, and the other one is to mitigate the impact of an issue. Okay, so square in a circle again, this is why I was laboring the point about risk, issue, and continuity. When we're thinking about transference, most of us understand that we use insurance to transfer the risk from ourselves to other parties, namely in this case, the insurance company. If you have a good understanding of your marketplace and maybe looking at your business model canvas, your key partners, you might be able to use contractual transference and transfer some of the risk to either your partners or to your customers. Okay, so that's another way of transferring a risk. And this contractual transference is massively overlooked. It's the kind of thing that you probably don't want to do with consumers, but if you've got a business to business, business to government, business to medical model, that might well be worth exploring. Cool. Thank you. Last couple of slides, please. So it's rather than thinking about kind of heat maps and traditional kind of PI matrices and stuff, though I have got one of those to have a look at in a moment, I find it's quite interesting to try and visualize things, because even high-performing individuals, technical experts like yourselves, we tend to be able to spot trends and gain insight graphically much better than from raw data. So if there's any way to be able to compare and contrast different levels of risk and likelihood visually, then do so. Okay, because we can capture and understand intuitively lots of data very quickly using visual tools. So this is just a quick visualization of various types of risk. Next slide, please, Daniel. Super. So you've probably seen this kind of probability. It's called a PI because it's a probability impact matrix. I've gone beyond just saying these are the kind of things that this is where you plot it, and said use this specifically as a way to guide how you address things. So at the top, I've just written down what those quadrants are. Below that is, this is the action, what you're going to do. Okay, so things like if the impact is going to be high but the probability is low, you either mitigate the effects of that happening, or you transfer that through through contractual or through insurance means. So if it's something to do with, there is going to be, I run an airline and I'm worried that there is going to be another volcanic eruption in Java or in Indonesia that's going to close down Southeast Asia. So as a plane operator, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I can maybe reroute around the affected area, and I may actually take out hedging on fuel for the extra trip, and I may also take out additional continuity and risk insurance in case that actually happens. So I'll be able to pay for all of those changes. Cool. Next slide, please. And the last slide here, this is something hopefully you're all seen or all been familiar with. We're normally used to seeing the first first four rather. So that's traditional risk register, as you would see in something like the project risk and management methodology for an association for project management. But to make it really useful in a practical organization or practically focused organization, I personally like to add the last three columns, which is who's going to measure it and how. So this is really about kind of data sampling and data mechanisms and data frequency or sampling frequency. The management, the practical steps, and then lastly, and this is the most important bit, the responsibility. Who's going to make sure that this is done? Because what tends to happen is people go through maybe a business planning process and a risk management process in order to get venture capital or in order to satisfy a bank manager. And then what happens is that just gets parked and it becomes a forgotten document. So in order to help make a risk register a living document, actually put in some form of monitoring frequency and who's responsible to make sure that it actually happens is a really good thing. So that's the kind of thing you can also incorporate into things like management review meetings, making sure someone's responsible for it, or change management. So if you're trying to look at the difference between a project baseline and how things have changed over time, make sure someone's publicly seen to be responsible and publicly accountable. So thank you very much for bearing with me. We have covered an awful lot of content there. I'm going to now ask both Francesca and Daniel if there are any interesting questions, comments or observations, and I'll be happy to answer you.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you everyone for bearing with us today. So yes, we have some questions for Robert. And so first of all, the first one is, how can we overcome the changing customer desires, especially in this crisis? For example, as the change in the fast foods needings?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I'd be inclined to take a step back and say, you're probably asking the wrong question. We don't overcome the changes. We're aware of the changing need of our customers, and then we reframe what we have to make sure that our offer is fit for their need. So that's what I would be inclined to do. So it's not about kind of addressing objections, really, which is a typical way that a salesperson might try and sell their product to a resistant customer. It's about understanding, what does the customer actually want to do or need to do now, or what are they prevented from doing?
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. That's a good question, though.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So there's another question regarding gap analysis. So it is, how do we prioritize, what to tackle first when we create our sort of, list of, what actually to do?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to try and contextualize this a little bit and give you some examples. In a past life, I worked at an American equity house, and what we did was we used Monte Carlo simulation to think about, to really massively accurately measure the world and what we thought the world would look like. So the Monte Carlo simulation, effectively, just to recap for everyone, this is a way of having a mathematical model, and you say, we understand every single variable in what we think the world would look like. And then what we do is we pin all variables except one, and then we infinitely vary that variable, and then we pin that one, you go to the next variable, we infinitely vary that. So we get the really horrible phrase, it's called a probability density matrix, which means that we look for where if we're doing it graphically, where the cluster of points is densest, or if we're looking at the function itself, where the highest probability of something happening is. Now, this is the kind of behavior that organizations with lots of resources, like an American equity house, or maybe a research department at university, you've got lots of clever people, lots of resources, lots of machines. You think you know what the world's going to look like. And on paper, you'd say, yeah, that absolutely works. But in the real world, I'm not going to tell you which organization I worked for, because it will just make us look bad. But in 6 months, we had 3 incredibly expensive and resource-intensive Monte Carlo simulations, all of which were wrong because people had forgotten to factor in 1 or 2 variables. So the key learning there is, the more complex a system is, the more difficult it is to model. Okay, the smarter you are, the more likely you are to believe you can model something like that. So that's the first takeaway. you run the risk of trying to do everything. So I'd be inclined to say, don't try and model everything, because if you model everything, you'll spend all of your time modeling, and you spend all of your time planning, and all of your time thinking about scenarios. I would take a step back and say, right, do what the Office for National Statistics does, or budgetary responsibility, and they say we have a worst case scenario and a best case scenario. I've used the phrase euphemistically, atomic options. So that's nothing happens and then something really horrible happens, and then in the middle between those two goalposts, two limits of our of what we believe to be possible, we have the most likely scenarios. So I would do a worst case, a best case, and then what I think is the most likely. And that's how I would prioritize. So sorry for the rather long, protracted answer to that.
No, absolutely. It was very, very insightful. And so actually, talking about plan and planning, what is, the difference of actually create a plan rather than creating a strategy?
Oh, that's interesting. It depends on your perspective, really. From a scenario, or thinking about alternative scenarios, that's really having multiple strategies. So if we think of a strategy as what's the difference between now and the future, and the changes we need to bring about to make sure that we're fit for the future, that's one strategy. Scenario planning is being aware that you might have alternative scenarios, so you have alternative strategies. So they're not really different. Scenario planning is a bit like the next step beyond a simple strategy. It's thinking about what's a contingency plan, or what else could I do if things go wrong?
Great, thank you so much, Robert.
No worries.
So, Robert, thank you so much for being with us today and hosting our webinar. Thank you for everyone who actually, attended this webinar with us today. If we can move to the next slide, Daniel, please. So, as I actually preempted at the beginning, our webinars are coming to an end already, and we are going to deliver the next two business strategy modules on the 22nd and the 28th. So if you haven't reserved your place just yet, please do. As you can see, we are going to have some very interesting themes. Again, how to set up a sustainable and successful business delivery from the get-go, and agility in an ever-changing market. So thank you so much. If you can go to the next slide, please. So thank you so much for being with us, to everyone. And just, bye for now, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye, and good luck.